she survived. Against every reasonable expectation, against a bullet wound and a kidnapping and an entire trilogy's worth of accumulated trauma, she survived. And now she's lying in a recovery bed, healing, breathing, alive, and the very first thought racing through her mind isn't relief. It isn't gratitude. It's a question that's going to define everything that happens over the course of this final chapter. Now that I've been given a second chance at this life, what exactly am I going to do with it? That question sounds simple. It is not simple. Because the life waiting for her on the other side of that hospital bed is still tangled, impossibly, hopelessly tangled, between two men who each represent something she desperately wants and neither of whom can fully give her what she actually needs. One of them is her husband, dangerous, possessive, the man who once kidnapped her and somehow, through sheer force of obsession and charisma, turned that kidnapping into a love story. The other is the man who tried to pull her away from that marriage entirely, patient, devoted, the kind of steady presence that should, by every rational measure, be the easy choice. And somewhere in the space between these two men, in the space between the woman she was before all of this began and the woman she's becoming now, after surviving things most people never have to survive, Laura has to figure out who she actually is, when nobody else is choosing for her. This is the final chapter of one of the most talked about, most polarizing, most undeniably successful erotic drama franchises of the streaming era. This is the next 365 days. Let's set the stage here, because understanding exactly how this trilogy built itself, and exactly what kind of cultural moment it landed inside, tells you a lot about why this final installment plays the way it does. The story begins, of course, with 365 Days, the 2020 film that became, almost overnight, one of the most watched and most controversial titles ever to land on a major streaming platform. Based on the first novel in a best-selling trilogy by Polish author Blanka Lipinska, that original film told the story of Laura Beale, a woman whose life gets violently upended when she's kidnapped by Massimo Torricelli, a wealthy, dangerous mafia heir who gives her exactly 365 days to fall in love with him before he lets her go. The premise was, by any conventional measure, deeply troubling, romanticizing captivity and coercive control in a way that drew sustained, vocal criticism from a wide range of viewers and commentators. And yet the film became a genuine cultural phenomenon anyway, propelled by exactly the kind of unapologetic, maximalist sensuality that made it one of the most streamed titles of its release year, launching its two lead actors, Anna Maria Siklucka and Michele Morrone, into a very specific, very intense kind of global fame. The sequel, 365 Days, This Day, arrived in 2022, picking up the story and introducing a new complication into Laura and Massimo's already volatile relationship in the form of Nacho, played by Simone Susinna, a charming, patient alternative to Massimo's possessive intensity. That film ended on a violent, dramatic cliffhanger, leaving Laura's fate uncertain and her relationships in genuine disarray. And now we arrive at the next 365 Days, released later that same year, also directed by Barbara Bialowicz and Tomasz Mondes, adapting the third and final novel in Lipinska's trilogy. This installment marks a deliberate, noticeable shift in the franchise's overall approach. Where the previous two films leaned heavily into mafia violence, danger, and possessive intensity as the engine driving their drama, this final chapter pulls back considerably from that violent machinery, choosing instead to center its story much more directly on Laura's own internal journey, her recovery, her uncertainty, her attempt to figure out what she actually wants now that she's survived everything the previous two films put her through. Critical reception across the trilogy was consistently brutal, and this final installment was no exception, with reviewers across the board describing it as critically panned, even by the standards of a franchise that had never courted critical respectability in the first place. But critical reception, in this particular case, never really mattered to the franchise's actual commercial trajectory. These films found their audience specifically by ignoring critical consensus entirely, succeeding instead through sheer, massive streaming numbers, word of mouth notoriety, and an audience that showed up specifically for exactly the kind of unrestrained, maximalist romantic and sexual drama that critics consistently dismissed as the film's primary flaw. So let's actually step inside this final chapter and trace exactly how Laura's journey resolves, because underneath all the controversy and all the criticism, there's a specific, deliberate emotional architecture at work here that's worth taking seriously on its own terms. The film opens with Massimo visiting the grave of his twin brother Adriano, who died during the violent climax of the previous installment. This opening matters more than it might initially seem to, because it immediately re-establishes the emotional cost that's accumulated across this entire trilogy. Massimo isn't simply a romantic lead returning for another round of drama. He's a man carrying real, accumulated grief, having lost his twin brother in violence connected directly to his relationship with Laura, and that grief sits underneath every subsequent interaction he has with her throughout this final chapter, whether the film explicitly acknowledges it or not. From the cemetery, Massimo goes directly to check on Laura, who is recovering from the violent attack that closed out the previous film, an assault carried out by Anna, Massimo's vengeful ex, and Adriano himself before his death. Laura survived a gunshot wound, survived a kidnapping, survived an entire cascade of violence that's been escalating across 2 previous films, and she's now, finally, in this 3rd installment, simply trying to heal, physically and emotionally, from everything that's happened to her. It's worth pausing here to actually sit with what Laura has been through across this trilogy, because the franchise's reputation as simple, unserious erotic content tends to obscure just how much actual trauma this character has accumulated by this point in the story. She was kidnapped. She fell in love with her kidnapper, in circumstances that any reasonable outside observer would recognize as deeply, troublingly coercive. She's been shot. She's lost a pregnancy. She's been caught, repeatedly, in the crossfire of mafia violence that has nothing directly to do with her own choices but everything to do with the dangerous world she's been pulled into through her relationship with Massimo. By the time this 3rd film begins, Laura is a woman who has survived an enormous amount, and the film's decision to actually center her recovery and her interiority, rather than simply moving on to the next plot complication, represents a genuine, if belated, attempt to take her experience seriously as something worth examining rather than simply a backdrop for more drama. The film's early scenes establish, with a directness some of the previous installments didn't always prioritize, the specific physical and emotional toll of what Laura has survived. Despite a doctor's explicit recommendation against intimacy during her recovery period, Laura, described in the story's own terms as sexually frustrated, ends up seducing Massimo during one of his business meetings, a sequence that the film plays as evidence of her returning vitality and desire rather than simply another excuse for the franchise's signature explicit content. This moment is worth examining a little more closely, because it tells you something important about how this film understands Laura's recovery process. Her desire to reconnect physically with Massimo, against medical advice, against caution, isn't framed simply as recklessness. It's framed as part of her broader attempt to reclaim agency over her own body and her own choices after surviving an experience that stripped so much of that agency away from her. That's a more thoughtful framing than the franchise's reputation might lead you to expect, even if the execution remains, consistently, in service of the explicit content the series has always centered. Afterward, relaxing with her best friend Olga, a character who's provided comic relief and grounded friendship throughout the entire trilogy, Laura reflects on what she describes as her miraculous survival, and begins, for the first time in this story, to genuinely wonder what she might do with this unexpected second chance at life. This conversation matters enormously to the film's overall emotional architecture, because it's the moment the story explicitly announces its actual thematic project for this final installment, not simply continuing the romantic drama between Laura, Massimo, and Nacho, but using that drama as a vehicle for examining what Laura herself actually wants, independent of either man's claims on her affection. It's during this exact reflective moment that her phone rings, and it's Nacho, calling to apologize for an earlier deception and confessing that he hasn't been able to stop thinking about her. This call reintroduces the franchise's central romantic triangle in earnest, and it's worth taking a moment to properly establish exactly what each of these two men represents within the story's emotional logic, because the entire rest of the film is going to be built around Laura's attempt to navigate between them. Massimo represents passion in its most intense, most dangerous form, a man whose love for Laura has never been separable from possessiveness, control, and a willingness to use violence in defense of his claim on her. The franchise has never fully pretended this isn't true about him, even while romanticizing it across its earlier installments. He's a man shaped by a violent criminal world, a man who lost his father and brother to that world's particular brutality, and his love for Laura, while genuine within the story's own terms, has always carried the specific danger of someone who sees her less as an independent person with her own autonomy and more as something precious to be protected, controlled, and kept. Nacho, by contrast, represents something the franchise has positioned as gentler, steadier, less consuming. He's patient. He's willing to wait for Laura to choose him rather than forcing the issue through manipulation or control. He represents, within the story's symbolic logic, the alternative path Laura might have had if she'd never been pulled into Massimo's dangerous world in the first place, a love built on partnership and respect rather than possession and danger. The film's middle stretch unfolds largely as Laura's attempt to navigate her own feelings toward both of these men while also, crucially, trying to rebuild some sense of independent identity outside of either relationship entirely. She returns to fashion, an interest and pursuit that's been part of her character since the franchise's earliest installments, but that's frequently been sidelined in favor of romantic drama. This return to creative, professional pursuit matters thematically, because it represents Laura attempting to reclaim a version of herself that exists independent of her romantic entanglements, a self defined by her own interests and ambitions rather than purely by which man she ultimately chooses. There's a sequence, often singled out by viewers and reviewers as one of the film's more genuinely affecting stretches, where Laura goes to stay with her parents for a period, stepping away entirely from both Massimo and Nacho, away from the dangerous, glamorous world of Sicily and mafia politics, back into something resembling ordinary, grounded life. This retreat functions as the film's clearest visual and narrative representation of Laura's attempt to clear her head, to access some version of herself that exists prior to and independent of the entire dramatic saga she's been living through across two previous films. It's worth noting that this stretch of the film represents a genuine, if modest, tonal departure from the franchise's established formula. Where the previous two films were built almost entirely around escalating danger, possessive conflict, and explicit content, this section allows for something closer to quiet, reflective character work, Laura simply existing, processing, trying to figure out her own desires without either man actively present to influence or pressure that process. Critics who found the franchise's earlier entries shallow have generally acknowledged, even while still panning this installment overall, that this attempt at interiority represents at least a genuine effort at something more substantive than pure spectacle. But the franchise's fundamental DNA reasserts itself fairly quickly, and the bulk of the film's remaining runtime returns to the central tension between Laura, Massimo, and Nacho, now complicated further by jealousy on all sides. Massimo, learning of Nacho's continued presence in Laura's life, struggles visibly with the kind of possessive insecurity that's defined his character across the entire trilogy, while Nacho, for his part, continues working, patiently and persistently, to pull Laura away from a marriage that he, and by extension the film, frames as fundamentally damaging to her well-being. Regardless of whatever genuine passion exists within it. This is where the film's title becomes thematically significant in a way worth dwelling on. Just as the original film's title referenced a literal, ticking countdown, a year given to Laura to either fall in love with her captor or be released, this final installment's title gestures toward a similar structure, another year, another extended period during which Laura is meant to figure out, definitively, what she actually wants from the rest of her life. But where the original countdown was imposed on her by Massimo, a condition of her captivity, this final countdown is something closer to self-imposed, a period of genuine, if messy, self-determination rather than externally enforced constraint. That shift, subtle as it might seem, represents the franchise's attempt to retroactively reframe its entire narrative arc as ultimately being about Laura's journey toward autonomy, even though that autonomy emerged from circumstances that remain, by any reasonable accounting, deeply troubling in their origins. The film builds toward its climax through a series of escalating confrontations between Massimo and Nacho, both vying, in their respective ways, for Laura's final, decisive choice. These confrontations are notably less violent than the equivalent sequences in the previous two installments, the film having largely, deliberately, stepped back from the mafia, violence machinery that drove so much of the earlier plotting. Instead, the tension here is rendered primarily through emotional and psychological conflict, Massimo's controlling jealousy versus Nacho's patient persistence, both men attempting to win Laura's heart through fundamentally different romantic strategies. The climactic sequence takes place on a beach, a setting the film uses deliberately to strip away the political, criminal, and familial complications that have surrounded Laura and Massimo's relationship throughout the entire trilogy, reducing the confrontation to something more elemental, simply two people, finally being honest with each other after years of accumulated deception, danger, and unresolved hurt. In this final confrontation, Massimo finally addresses, directly and with genuine apparent remorse, the specific betrayal that's haunted their relationship throughout much of this trilogy, the secret he kept from Laura regarding the loss of their child. A deception that compounded her grief with the additional wound of having been kept in the dark about crucial information concerning her own pregnancy and its loss. He acknowledges, in this scene, real understanding of the pain this secrecy caused her, and offers something closer to genuine accountability than his character has typically displayed across the earlier installments of the franchise. This moment matters considerably to how the film wants its audience to understand Massimo by the story's conclusion. He's not simply asking for forgiveness through romantic gesture or persistence, the way the franchise has frequently allowed him to operate in earlier films. He's being asked, finally, to actually reckon with the specific harm his deception caused, and the film gives him space to attempt that reckoning, even if it remains genuinely ambiguous whether that attempt fully redeems the broader pattern of control and possessiveness that's defined his character throughout the entire trilogy. Laura, in response, begins to articulate something that the film positions as her most important realization across the entire three-film arc, that she has spent an enormous amount of time feeling imprisoned by this relationship, even within its moments of genuine passion and connection, and that this feeling of imprisonment, regardless of how much love coexists alongside it, is something she can no longer simply accept or rationalize away. This is, structurally, the film's most significant thematic statement, and it's worth giving it real weight, because it represents the franchise finally explicitly naming the exact tension that's defined its entire premise from the very beginning. Laura's relationship with Massimo has always contained genuine passion and genuine danger in equal measure, and this final film, for the first time across the entire trilogy, allows its protagonist to name that danger directly, to acknowledge that intensity of feeling and freedom of choice aren't actually the same thing, even when a relationship's surface-level romantic intensity might make them feel, in the moment, indistinguishable. The film, notably, doesn't resolve this tension with a clean, decisive choice. Laura's conversations with her parents, her time alone, her reconnection with her own independent interests and identity throughout the film's middle stretch, have helped her access genuine clarity about her own feelings, but that clarity doesn't resolve neatly into simply choosing one man over the other. The film's ending leaves her future deliberately, explicitly open-ended, emphasizing, in its final stretch, that her actual happiness depends less on which specific man she ends up with and more on her own capacity to make a choice, any choice, that genuinely reflects her own desires rather than being shaped entirely by either man's claims on her. Let's sit with that ending for a moment, because it represents a more interesting, if still imperfect, conclusion than the franchise's reputation might lead you to expect. Rather than delivering a tidy resolution where Laura definitively chooses Massimo's passion or Nacho's stability, the film leaves genuine ambiguity in place, suggesting that the actual point of her journey across this entire trilogy was never really about which man she ends up with, but about whether she's capable, finally, of making that choice from a place of genuine autonomy and self-knowledge rather than from fear, obligation, or simple romantic intensity. That's a more thoughtful thematic conclusion than the franchise generally gets credit for, even while acknowledging that the actual execution of getting there remains deeply uneven, weighed down by exactly the kind of narrative thinness and tonal inconsistency that critics consistently pointed to throughout the entire trilogy's run. Let's step back now and really examine what's actually happening underneath all of this romantic and sexual drama, because there's a specific, if imperfectly executed, thematic architecture worth taking seriously, even within a franchise this widely dismissed by mainstream critical consensus. At its core, this final installment is attempting something the previous two films largely avoided: an actual examination of trauma recovery and personal agency in the aftermath of an intensely controlling, dangerous relationship. Laura's journey across this film, her physical recovery, her return to independent professional pursuits, her retreat to her family, her eventual, hard-won clarity about the difference between passion and freedom, represents a genuine attempt to give this character an interior life and a personal arc that exists beyond simply functioning as the object of two men's competing desires. That attempt is worth recognizing, even while acknowledging that it remains compromised by the franchise's foundational premise, a relationship that began through kidnapping and coercion being subsequently romanticized across two entire films before this third installment finally, belatedly, asks its protagonist to reckon with the genuine cost of that history. There's an inherent tension in a story attempting to deliver a message about reclaiming personal agency and autonomy while built on top of a romantic foundation that fundamentally violated that exact agency and autonomy from its very first act. The film doesn't fully resolve this tension, and it's fair to say that no amount of belated thematic ambition in this third installment can entirely retroactively justify or reframe the troubling premise that launched the entire franchise. But within the specific, limited terms this film is operating in, there's something genuinely worth examining in how it handles the specific psychological aftermath of surviving intense, dangerous romantic experiences. Laura's struggle throughout this film, feeling genuine, undeniable passion toward Massimo while simultaneously recognizing the danger and loss of self that passion has historically demanded of her, speaks to something real about how difficult it actually is to disentangle love from harm when both have been so thoroughly intertwined across years of lived experience. That's a genuinely complicated, genuinely human psychological reality, even when it's being explored through a story built on a foundation as troubling as this franchise's central premise. Massimo's arc across this final installment also deserves some thematic consideration, because the film does attempt, in its own limited way, to humanize his possessiveness as something rooted in genuine trauma rather than simply presenting it as an unexamined character trait. His grief over his brother's death, established in the film's opening scene, his complicated relationship with a violent family legacy that's shaped his entire understanding of love and loyalty, his admission of guilt and remorse during the climactic beach confrontation, all of this attempts to position his controlling tendencies as a product of genuine psychological wounding rather than simply an inherent, unexamined character flaw. Whether that attempt at humanization succeeds in actually redeeming the character, or whether it simply provides a more sophisticated, sounding justification for behavior that remains fundamentally troubling, is a question the film leaves genuinely, perhaps unintentionally, open. There's a real argument to be made that understanding the roots of someone's controlling, possessive behavior doesn't actually excuse or resolve the harm that behavior causes, and the film's ending, in its deliberate refusal to definitively resolve Laura's choice between Massimo and Nacho, can be read as the story's own quiet acknowledgement that it hasn't fully settled this question either, that Massimo's growth and apparent remorse, while genuine within the story's terms, may not be sufficient to actually justify Laura choosing to remain in a relationship that's caused her this much demonstrated harm. Nacho's role within this final installment's thematic architecture deserves attention as well, because the franchise positions him, consistently, as the safer, healthier alternative without ever fully interrogating whether that framing is entirely earned. His patience and persistence, while gentler in execution than Massimo's possessiveness, still ultimately function as another man's claim on Laura's affection and attention, another external force she has to navigate and respond to rather than simply being left alone to determine her own path without any man's competing desires shaping that determination. The film doesn't fully grapple with this irony, that even its supposedly healthier romantic option still requires Laura to orient her choices around a man's continued pursuit of her, but it's worth noting as a quiet, perhaps unintentional, limitation in how thoroughly the film actually commits to its stated theme of personal autonomy. There's also something worth examining in how this final film handles Laura's relationship with her own body and sexuality throughout her recovery process. The franchise has always centered explicit content as a core part of its appeal, and this installment is no exception, but the specific framing of Laura's early seduction of Massimo during her recovery, against medical advice, against caution, suggests an attempt to position her sexuality as something she's actively reclaiming and directing, rather than simply something happening to her or being used as a tool of control by either man. That's a meaningfully different framing than the franchise's earlier installments generally offered, even if the underlying explicit content itself remains formally similar across all three films. Let's talk for a moment about the craftsmanship behind this final installment, because the film's tonal shift away from violence and toward interiority represents a genuine, if not entirely successful, attempt at creative evolution within an established formula. Directors Barbara Bialawas and Tomasz Mondes, returning from the previous installment, make a deliberate choice to slow the film's pacing considerably compared to its predecessors, allowing for extended sequences of quiet character reflection that the earlier, more plot and violence-driven entries rarely permitted. This choice produces mixed results. Some viewers and reviewers found this shift toward interiority a welcome change of pace, evidence of a franchise attempting to grow beyond its initial, narrower formula. Others found the slower pacing simply exposed how thin the underlying narrative actually was once stripped of the violence and danger that had previously provided forward momentum, leaving extended stretches of the film feeling aimless and repetitive. The film's visual style remains consistent with the franchise's established aesthetic: glossy, sun-drenched Mediterranean and Sicilian locations, fashion-forward costuming, a general visual sensibility built around aspirational luxury and beauty. This consistency provides a kind of visual comfort for returning audiences, even as the narrative content shifts toward more reflective territory, the film's surface level glamour remaining a constant throughout even as its actual dramatic engine slows down considerably. The soundtrack deserves specific mention, because multiple reviewers pointed to its frequent, sometimes intrusive use of vocal pop music during scenes that might have otherwise benefited from quieter, more restrained scoring choices. There's a legitimate critique here worth taking seriously. Certain emotionally vulnerable moments between characters, particularly in the film's climactic stretches, get undercut by music choices that pull focus away from the actual performances and dialogue happening on screen, robbing potentially affecting scenes of the quieter intimacy they might have achieved with more restrained sound design. The central performances continue to carry whatever emotional weight the film manages to generate. Anna Maria Siklucka, given considerably more interior material to work with in this installment than the previous two films generally afforded her character, handles the shift toward genuine introspection with reasonable effectiveness, even within a screenplay that doesn't always give her fully developed material to work with. Michele Morrone's performance as Massimo attempts real vulnerability during the film's climactic confrontation, though the character's fundamental contradictions, genuine remorse alongside a pattern of behavior the film never fully reconciles with that remorse, remain imperfectly resolved by the writing itself rather than by any failure of performance. Simone Susinna's Nacho remains, across this final installment, somewhat thinly sketched, functioning more as a symbolic alternative to Massimo than as a fully realized character in his own right, a limitation that's persisted across the character's introduction in the previous film and continues largely unaddressed here. If there are legitimate critiques to level against this film, and there are many, they tend to cluster around exactly the issues critics consistently raised throughout the entire trilogy's run: thin plotting, dialogue that frequently prioritizes romantic and sexual drama over genuine character development, a tendency to tell rather than show key emotional beats, and an overall narrative structure that struggles to sustain genuine dramatic tension once it's stripped away the violence and danger that propelled the earlier installments. This film's attempt to pivot towards something more reflective and character-driven is, in some ways, admirable in its ambition, but the underlying screenplay and character work simply isn't developed enough to fully support that more ambitious approach, leaving large stretches of the film feeling underwritten even as they reach for genuine emotional and thematic substance. There's also a reasonable critique to be made about the film's handling of its central romantic triangle resolution. By ending on such a deliberately open-ended note, the film avoids having to fully commit to and defend any particular conclusion about Laura's choice between Massimo and Nacho, which can read, depending on your perspective, as either a thoughtful, mature refusal to provide false narrative closure, or as a franchise simply unwilling to make a definitive artistic statement about its own central romantic conflict, leaving the ultimate question of which relationship the story actually endorses. Frustratingly unresolved after 3 entire films built around exactly that question. So where does that leave us, at the end of this particular trilogy's long, controversial journey? The next 365 days succeeds, modestly and unevenly, at what it actually attempts, pivoting a franchise built on violence, possession, and controversial romanticization of coercive control towards something resembling genuine reflection on trauma, recovery, and personal autonomy. It doesn't fully succeed at this pivot. The underlying screenplay remains too thin to fully support the more ambitious thematic territory it's reaching for, and the franchise's foundational premise remains too troubling to be fully redeemed by one installment's belated attempt at deeper characterization. But there's something worth acknowledging in a story that began by romanticizing a kidnapping eventually arriving, even imperfectly, even incompletely, at a conclusion suggesting that genuine happiness requires more than intense passion, that it requires the freedom to actually choose, clearly and autonomously, rather than simply being swept along by whichever man happens to want you most intensely. Final rating: 4 out of 10. A film that deserves modest credit for attempting genuine thematic growth and reflection within a franchise that previously showed little interest in either, undermined considerably by thin plotting, uneven pacing, and a fundamental inability to fully reconcile its belated message about personal autonomy with the deeply troubling romantic premise the entire trilogy was originally built upon. If this breakdown gave you a clearer sense of how this trilogy actually concludes, and what it was attempting underneath all the controversy, let me know in the comments whether you think Laura made the right call, or the right non-call. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more stories left to unpack. Let's spend some additional time now placing this film within the broader cultural conversation it emerged from, because understanding exactly why this franchise generated the specific kind of controversy and devotion it did helps explain why this final installment plays the way it does. When the original 365 Days landed on a major streaming platform back in 2020, it arrived into a cultural moment defined by intense, ongoing debate about consent, romance, and exactly what kinds of stories mainstream entertainment should be comfortable romanticizing. The film's central premise, a woman kidnapped and given a year to fall in love with her captor, sat directly in the crosshairs of that debate, and the response it generated split almost immediately into two camps that rarely found common ground. One camp viewed the film, and the broader trend of media it represented, as actively dangerous, normalizing coercive control and stripping away the genuine horror of kidnapping and captivity in favor of glossy, aspirational romance. The other camp, often overlapping with longtime readers of the source novels and longtime fans of erotic romance as a literary genre, viewed the criticism as a kind of moral panic directed at women's sexual fantasy, pointing out that the genre of dangerous, possessive romantic heroes has existed in popular fiction for generations, long before this particular franchise arrived to reignite the debate in a new, more visible format. Both of these positions carry genuine merit, and it's worth resisting the temptation to simply pick one side and dismiss the other entirely. The concern that media romanticizing coercive control can normalize genuinely harmful relationship dynamics, particularly for younger or more vulnerable viewers without the critical distance to separate fantasy from healthy relationship modeling, is a legitimate concern grounded in real patterns of how media consumption can shape expectations and norms. At the same time, the broader literary and cinematic tradition of dangerous, controlling romantic heroes, stretching back through decades of romance novels and Gothic fiction, has always existed specifically as fantasy, as a space for exploring intensity and power dynamics in fiction precisely because most readers and viewers understand, consciously or not, that fantasy and aspiration for one's actual life are not the same thing. This third and final installment arrives into that ongoing tension, having to somehow account for it, at least implicitly. After two entire films that largely leaned into and amplified exactly the elements critics found most troubling. And it's worth recognizing that this film's pivot toward interiority, toward Laura's recovery and her search for genuine autonomy, can be read as the franchise's own belated, imperfect attempt to respond to that criticism, to suggest, even if clumsily, that the story was always secretly about something more than simple romanticization of captivity, that it was actually building, across three entire films, toward a protagonist who finally recognizes the difference between passionate intensity and genuine freedom. Whether that retroactive reframing is convincing is, frankly, a matter of genuine debate, and reasonable viewers can land on either side of it. But it's worth taking seriously as the film's actual creative intention, rather than dismissing this final installment's more reflective stretches as simply incidental filler between explicit scenes, because the care taken in constructing Laura's arc throughout this particular film suggests genuine, if imperfectly executed, thematic ambition on the part of everyone involved in bringing this final chapter to the screen. Let's also spend some real time examining the specific cultural and literary lineage this franchise draws from, because understanding that lineage helps contextualize exactly what this story is attempting, even when the execution falls short. The genre of romance fiction featuring dangerous, wealthy, controlling male leads has an enormously long history, predating this particular franchise by generations. Gothic romance novels of previous centuries built entire literary traditions around brooding, dangerous men and the women drawn to them despite, or sometimes specifically because of, the danger they represented. More contemporary romance fiction has continued this tradition through countless variations: the billionaire romance subgenre, the mafia romance subgenre, the captor romance subgenre, each building on a similar set of underlying fantasies about intensity, danger, and the specific thrill of being desired so completely that a powerful man would risk everything, including conventional morality, to claim you. This literary tradition exists, by and large, as a specific kind of fantasy space, one explicitly understood by its primary audience to operate according to different rules than reality, a space where danger gets stripped of its genuine, lived consequences and repackaged as pure romantic intensity. The criticism this franchise generated wasn't really about whether such fantasy spaces should exist at all. That ship sailed generations ago within popular romance fiction. It was more specifically about the visibility and mainstream accessibility this particular franchise achieved through a major streaming platform, reaching an audience considerably broader and considerably less self-selected than the audience that typically seeks out romance novels specifically built around these particular tropes. That distinction matters, because it helps explain why this particular franchise generated such outsized controversy compared to the countless romance novels exploring similar territory in print form, with far less mainstream visibility and far less cultural conversation surrounding them. The visual, explicit nature of film as a medium, combined with the sheer reach of a major streaming platform's algorithm-driven promotion, took content that might have remained within a more self-selected readership and pushed it into broader cultural visibility, generating exactly the kind of widespread debate that print romance novels exploring similar themes rarely attract at the same scale. This final installment, in attempting its pivot toward Laura's interiority and eventual recognition of the difference between passion and freedom, is essentially trying to have it both ways, delivering the continued fantasy intensity its established audience expects while also gesturing toward a more critical, more self-aware perspective on that exact fantasy, for whatever portion of its audience might be receptive to that more reflective register. It's a genuinely difficult balancing act, and the film's uneven success at achieving it reflects, in part, just how difficult that specific creative challenge actually is. Let's turn now to a more detailed examination of Laura's psychological journey across this specific film, because there's more nuance here worth unpacking than a straightforward plot summary typically allows for. Trauma recovery, in genuine psychological terms, rarely follows a clean, linear path, and to the film's credit, Laura's journey across this installment reflects at least some of that genuine messiness rather than presenting a tidy, straightforward arc from victim to empowered survivor. Her early seduction of Massimo against medical advice isn't framed by the film as a mistake or a setback in her recovery, nor is it framed as unambiguous evidence of healthy reclamation of agency. It exists in a genuinely ambiguous space, evidence simultaneously of her returning vitality and desire, and evidence of a continued, perhaps not fully examined, pullback toward exactly the dynamic that's caused her so much demonstrated harm throughout this entire trilogy. That ambiguity, whether intentional or simply a byproduct of inconsistent screenwriting, actually captures something genuinely true about how people often process recovery from intense, damaging relationships. The pullback toward familiar patterns, even patterns that have caused genuine harm, is a well-documented psychological reality, and Laura's continued attraction to Massimo throughout this film, even as she's simultaneously articulating genuine clarity about the danger and loss of self that attraction has historically demanded of her, reflects something true about how difficult it actually is to simply will yourself out of an intense attachment, regardless of how clearly you can articulate. Intellectually, the reasons you should probably do exactly that. This is worth dwelling on, because it complicates any simple reading of the film's ending as either a triumphant assertion of independence or a disappointing retreat back into old patterns. The genuine answer the film leaves us with is messier and more honest than either of those simple readings, suggesting that Laura's relationship to her own desire for Massimo remains complicated, remains unresolved, remains something she's still actively working through even as the credits roll, rather than something she's definitively, cleanly overcome. Let's also spend more time examining the specific function Olga serves throughout this film, because her friendship with Laura deserves more careful attention than its supporting role might initially suggest. Across this entire trilogy, Olga has functioned as a kind of stable emotional anchor, a relationship built on genuine history, shared humor, and mutual support rather than romantic or sexual tension. That stability matters enormously within a story otherwise defined by intense, often dangerous romantic and sexual drama, providing Laura, and by extension the audience, with at least one relationship that operates according to entirely different, considerably healthier rules than everything else happening in her life. In this final installment specifically, Olga's role expands slightly to include more explicit commentary on Laura's situation, offering perspective and occasional gentle pushback that the film uses as a vehicle for articulating themes it might otherwise struggle to convey through Laura's internal monologue alone. There's a function here similar to the role a Greek chorus might play in classical drama, a trusted outside voice helping both the protagonist and the audience process and contextualize events as they unfold, without that voice ever fully directing or controlling the protagonist's ultimate choices. This dynamic between Laura and Olga also provides one of the film's more consistently successful comedic threads, a welcome tonal counterbalance to the heavier, more dramatic material surrounding Laura's central romantic dilemma. Their scenes together carry a lightness and genuine warmth that contrasts deliberately with the intensity and danger characterizing Laura's interactions with both Massimo and Nacho, reinforcing, through pure tonal contrast, the film's broader argument that genuine, healthy connection looks and feels considerably different from the intense, consuming passion the franchise has spent 3 films exploring through its central romantic triangle. Let's also take a more detailed look at how this film handles its supporting cast more broadly, because there are smaller character beats throughout that contribute meaningfully to the film's overall thematic project, even if they receive relatively limited screen time. Massimo's extended family and the broader criminal world surrounding him, established extensively across the previous 2 films, recede considerably into the background throughout this final installment. A deliberate choice that reinforces the film's overall pivot away from mafia, violence plotting and toward more intimate, character-focused drama. This recession matters thematically, because it suggests, visually and structurally, an attempt to extract Laura's personal romantic journey from the broader criminal machinery that's repeatedly endangered her life across the previous 2 films, even though that machinery, by the story's own internal logic, remains an inescapable part of what loving Massimo actually means and actually requires her to accept. There's a worth noting tension here between the film's narrative content, mostly stepping back from criminal danger to focus on personal, romantic reflection, and the underlying reality the story still has to acknowledge, that choosing to remain with Massimo means choosing to remain enmeshed in a dangerous criminal world that has already cost Laura enormously throughout this trilogy. The film's relative narrative silence on this broader danger throughout much of its runtime can be read as a structural weakness, an avoidance of fully reckoning with exactly what continuing this relationship would actually mean and require, but it can also be read as a deliberate choice to let Laura's more immediate, personal psychological journey takes center stage without that journey being constantly interrupted by external plot machinery, even at the cost of leaving certain larger questions about her actual future safety and stability somewhat unaddressed. Let's also revisit, in more detail, the specific dynamics at play during the film's handling of jealousy and possessiveness across its central triangle, because there's a meaningful distinction the film draws, even if imperfectly, between Massimo's jealousy and Nacho's more patient approach to pursuing Laura's affection. Massimo's jealousy throughout this film carries real, visible cost, manifesting in moments of genuine emotional volatility that echo, even in this more restrained installment, the controlling tendencies that have defined his character throughout the entire trilogy. Watching him struggle with Nacho's continued presence in Laura's life, the film allows real discomfort to surface, moments where his possessiveness reads not as romantic passion but as something closer to genuine emotional instability, a man whose sense of identity and security remains, even after everything he's survived and supposedly learned, fundamentally dependent on total, exclusive claim over Laura's attention and affection. Nacho's patience, by contrast, while framed by the film as the healthier alternative, carries its own subtler form of pressure, a persistent presence that, however gentle in its specific expression, still ultimately functions as ongoing pursuit, another claim on Laura's attention and eventual choice that she has to continually navigate and respond to. The film doesn't fully interrogate whether patient, gentle pursuit is genuinely categorically different from possessive, jealous pursuit, or whether it simply represents a more socially acceptable, less visibly troubling version of the same underlying dynamic. Two men competing for a woman's choice rather than that woman simply being given genuine space to determine her own path without either man's competing desires actively shaping that determination throughout the entire process. This is, I think, one of the more interesting unexamined tensions running throughout this final installment, and throughout the franchise more broadly. The story wants to argue, by its conclusion, that Laura's journey has been fundamentally about reclaiming personal autonomy and freedom of choice. But the actual narrative structure never fully allows her that freedom in practice. Every single scene of her supposed self-discovery and reflection remains structured around, and interrupted by, one or both of these men's continued, active pursuit of her attention and affection. True autonomy, in the fullest sense the film seems to want to gesture toward, would presumably require Laura to have genuine space to determine her own desires without either man's competing claims actively shaping and pressuring that determination throughout the process, and the film never quite manages to create that genuinely uninterrupted space, even during its quieter, more reflective stretches. Let's spend additional time on the film's handling of grief and loss as well, because the earlier loss of Laura and Massimo's pregnancy, referenced throughout this trilogy and revisited explicitly during the climactic beach confrontation, deserves more careful attention than the film's pacing typically affords it. The specific betrayal at the center of that earlier loss, Massimo's decision to keep crucial information from Laura regarding the circumstances and details of that loss, represents one of the most genuinely serious breaches of trust within their entire relationship, arguably more damaging in its own way than even the more overtly dramatic, more visually dramatic moments of danger and violence that have defined the franchise's earlier installments. Secrecy of this kind, withholding crucial, deeply personal information from a partner during an experience as devastating as pregnancy loss, represents a profound violation of basic relational trust, regardless of whatever protective justification Massimo might have constructed for himself in choosing that secrecy. The film's climactic confrontation finally addresses this betrayal directly, and it's worth recognizing that this specific reckoning carries more genuine emotional weight than much of the rest of the film's drama, precisely because it's addressing a wound that doesn't stem from the franchise's more sensationalized elements of danger and criminal violence, but from something far more universally recognizable: the genuine devastation of losing a pregnancy, compounded by the additional betrayal of discovering that your partner withheld crucial truth about that loss from you during your most vulnerable moment. Massimo's acknowledgement of this specific harm, and his apparent genuine remorse during this confrontation, carries real weight within the film's emotional architecture, precisely because this particular wound feels more grounded, more universally recognizable, than the franchise's more elaborate plotting around mafia politics and rival families. It's worth noting that this stretch of the film, dealing directly with grief, loss, and the specific betrayal of withheld truth during a partner's most vulnerable moment, represents some of the more genuinely affecting material across the entire trilogy, suggesting that this franchise, when it actually slows down enough to engage with universal human experiences of loss and betrayal rather than relying primarily on its more sensationalized elements, is capable of generating real emotional resonance, even within a story otherwise burdened by considerable narrative and tonal inconsistency. Let's also take some additional time to examine how this film's visual and stylistic choices specifically support, or occasionally undermine, its thematic ambitions, because there's more craft worth discussing here than the franchise's general critical dismissal typically allows for. The decision to set the climactic confrontation on an open beach, discussed earlier in this breakdown, represents a meaningful visual choice, but it's worth examining the specific cinematographic approach taken during that sequence in more detail. The framing throughout this scene tends toward closer, more intimate shots than the franchise's typical visual language, which has generally favored wider, more aspirational shots showcasing wealth, luxury, and grand architectural spaces. This shift toward intimacy in framing during the climactic confrontation reinforces, visually, the film's broader argument that this conversation represents something more genuine and stripped down than the performative wealth and power dynamics that have characterized so much of Laura and Massimo's relationship throughout the rest of the trilogy. Lighting choices throughout this sequence also deserve mention, with the scene taking place during what appears to be late afternoon or early evening light, the kind of softer, warmer illumination that cinematographers frequently use to suggest vulnerability and emotional openness, in deliberate visual contrast to the harsher, more dramatically lit interior sequences that have characterized much of the franchise's depiction of Massimo's world throughout the previous two installments. This attention to lighting and framing during the film's most thematically important sequence suggests genuine directorial intentionality, even within a film that, in other stretches, relies on more conventional, less carefully considered visual choices. Let's also spend time discussing the franchise's overall legacy and cultural footprint, because understanding where this final installment sits within that broader legacy helps contextualize its specific strengths and limitations. By the time this third film arrived, the 365 Days franchise had already achieved a specific, durable kind of cultural notoriety, less critically respected than almost any other major streaming success of its era, but commercially and culturally significant regardless of that critical dismissal. The franchise became, in its own particular way, a kind of cultural shorthand, frequently referenced in broader conversations about streaming algorithms, about the specific kind of content that achieves massive viewership numbers while remaining almost entirely disconnected from critical or awards season conversation, about the specific dynamics of how international content, in this case a Polish production, can achieve massive global streaming success in a way that traditional theatrical distribution models rarely allow for non-English language productions to achieve. This final installment's relatively muted box office and streaming performance compared to its predecessors, alongside its uniformly negative critical reception, suggests a franchise that had largely exhausted its initial cultural moment by the time this third film arrived. The novelty and controversy that drove the original film's massive viewership numbers having dissipated considerably by the time audiences encountered this considerably less controversial, more reflective conclusion to the story. There's a certain irony in this trajectory, that the franchise's attempt to grow beyond its initial, more sensationalized formula arrived at almost exactly the moment when its audience's appetite for the franchise's central romantic drama, regardless of its specific tonal register, had already begun to wane. That timing matters for understanding why this third film, despite arguably representing the franchise's most genuine attempt at thematic and character development, didn't generate nearly the same level of cultural conversation or viewership enthusiasm as its predecessors. Audiences who showed up specifically for the franchise's established formula of intense passion, danger, and explicit content found this installment's more reflective, slower, paced approach a disappointing departure from what initially drew them to the franchise, while audiences who might have been more receptive to genuine thematic growth and reflection had likely already been alienated by the franchise's earlier, more troubling installments and simply never gave this third film a fair chance to demonstrate its more ambitious intentions. Let's close out this expanded examination by considering, one final time, what this franchise's overall trajectory might suggest about the broader landscape of streaming-era romantic drama, and what lessons, if any, future productions in this specific genre space might draw from both this franchise's massive initial success and its more uneven, more critically dismissed conclusion. The original film's massive success demonstrated, definitively, that there remains enormous audience appetite for unapologetic, maximalist romantic and sexual drama, content that critics and cultural commentators might dismiss as shallow or even actively harmful, but that nonetheless connects with a massive, genuinely engaged audience specifically because it delivers exactly the kind of intense, uncomplicated fantasy fulfillment that more critically respected, more nuanced romantic dramas often deliberately avoid in favor of greater psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. This final installment's attempt to introduce that greater complexity and moral ambiguity, while admirable in its ambition, ultimately demonstrates the genuine difficulty of pivoting an established franchise built on pure, uncomplicated fantasy fulfillment towards something more reflective and psychologically nuanced, without alienating the established audience that came to the franchise specifically for what it offered in its earlier, less complicated form. That's a genuinely difficult creative challenge, and the fact that this film doesn't fully succeed at navigating it shouldn't necessarily be read as evidence that the attempt itself was misguided, so much as evidence of just how difficult this particular kind of tonal and thematic evolution actually is to execute successfully within an established commercial franchise. Whether future productions in this space will learn from this specific franchise's trajectory, finding more successful ways to balance fantasy fulfillment with genuine psychological complexity and thoughtful examination of the specific power dynamics these stories tend to explore, remains an open question. But the 365 Days trilogy's overall arc, from unapologetic, controversial fantasy to a more reflective, if imperfectly executed, conclusion grappling with the genuine cost and complexity of the relationships it spent its earlier installments romanticizing, represents a genuinely interesting case study in exactly how difficult, and how rarely fully successful, that kind of creative evolution tends to be within franchises built on this particular kind of foundational premise. Final rating, 4 out of 10. A film that deserves modest credit for attempting genuine thematic growth and reflection within a franchise that previously showed little interest in either, undermined considerably by thin plotting, uneven pacing, and a fundamental inability to fully reconcile its belated message about personal autonomy with the deeply troubling romantic premise the entire trilogy was originally built upon. If this breakdown gave you a clearer sense of how this trilogy actually concludes, and what it was attempting underneath all the controversy, let me know in the comments whether you think Laura made the right call, or the right non-call. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more stories left to unpack. Before we close this out completely, let's go back and spend a little more time on a handful of specific moments, because there's more texture here worth examining than a single pass through the plot usually captures. Let's return to that opening cemetery scene, because the specific staging of Massimo's grief deserves a slower look. Notice how the film frames this moment, not as a brief, perfunctory acknowledgement of the previous film's body count, but as a genuine, lingering moment of mourning. Massimo visiting his twin brother's grave isn't simply plot housekeeping. It's the film's first, clearest signal that this installment intends to take emotional consequence more seriously than its predecessors generally did. Adriano's death wasn't simply a dramatic plot beat to be resolved and moved past. It's something Massimo is still actively carrying, still actively grieving, as this new chapter of the story begins. This matters because it recontextualizes Massimo's subsequent behavior throughout the rest of the film. His possessiveness toward Laura, his jealousy regarding Nacho, his struggle to fully reckon with the harm his secrecy has caused her, all of it is happening against the backdrop of a man who has just lost his twin brother, his closest blood relation, in violence directly connected to the same dangerous world that's also threatened Laura's life repeatedly across this trilogy. That grief doesn't excuse his controlling behavior, but it does add a layer of genuine, lived psychological weight to his character that a simpler, less attentive opening might have skipped past entirely. Let's also spend more time with Laura's recovery sequence, because there's a specific detail worth highlighting in how the film stages her physical healing process. The film takes care to show the actual physical toll of what Laura survived, not simply gesturing at her recovery in the abstract but lingering on specific details of her healing process, the visible reminders of her gunshot wound, the doctor's explicit caution about her physical limitations, the genuine fragility underlying her return to apparent normalcy. This attention to physical detail matters, because it grounds what could otherwise feel like an abstract, narratively convenient recovery in something more visceral and real. Laura isn't simply narratively reset to her previous baseline the moment the plot requires her to be functional again. The film insists, at least in these early scenes, on the genuine cost of what she survived. That's worth appreciating, even while acknowledging that this attention to physical and emotional realism doesn't extend evenly across the entire rest of the film. There's a tension throughout this installment between moments of genuine, careful attention to Laura's psychological and physical state, and moments where the franchise's established formula, glamour, romance, explicit content, simply reasserts itself without much regard for the more careful character work established elsewhere in the same film. Let's go deeper into the retreat to Laura's parents as well, because this stretch of the film deserves more careful examination than a quick plot summary usually affords it. What's notable about this sequence isn't simply that Laura leaves the dangerous, glamorous orbit of Massimo's world for a period. It's the specific quality of stillness the film allows during these scenes, a deliberate slowing of pace that stands in genuine contrast to the franchise's usual rhythm of escalating drama and explicit content. We get extended scenes of Laura simply existing within her family's ordinary domestic space, conversations with her parents that aren't building toward any particular dramatic revelation, just the simple, grounding experience of being somewhere safe, somewhere familiar, somewhere entirely disconnected from the high-stakes romantic and criminal drama that's defined her life across the previous two films. This stretch of the film functions almost as a deliberate tonal palette cleanser, and it's worth noting that this is precisely the section of the film that even critics generally inclined to dismiss the franchise found at least somewhat effective. There's a genuine, if modest, power in watching a character defined almost entirely, across two previous films, by her relationships with dangerous, demanding men, simply be allowed to exist quietly, without either of those men present, for an extended stretch of screen time. That quiet absence of romantic and sexual drama, however briefly sustained, does real work in selling the film's eventual thematic argument about Laura needing space and independence to actually access clarity about her own desires. Let's also revisit the specific content of Laura's conversation with Olga about her survival and her second chance, because there's a detail worth highlighting in how that scene is constructed. Olga has functioned, across this entire trilogy, as Laura's primary connection to a version of herself that exists outside her romantic entanglements, a friendship grounded in shared history, humor, and genuine affection rather than romantic or sexual tension. That friendship matters considerably to this film's thematic architecture, because it represents one of the only consistent relationships in Laura's life that isn't structured around a man's desire for her. The fact that this pivotal moment of reflection, Laura first articulating her question about what to do with her second chance, happens specifically within this friendship, rather than in conversation with either Massimo or Nacho, is a meaningful structural choice. It suggests, even if the film doesn't fully follow through on this implication throughout its remaining runtime, that genuine self-knowledge and clarity might be more accessible to Laura within relationships not defined by romantic stakes than within the central romantic triangle that dominates the rest of the story. Let's also take a closer look at the specific staging of the climactic beach confrontation, because the choice of setting carries more symbolic weight than a simple summary captures. The beach. Stripped of the ornate, wealth-signaling interiors that have defined so much of this trilogy's visual language, mansion interiors, yacht decks, luxury vehicles, represents a deliberate visual reset, a space where Laura and Massimo can interact without the constant visual reminder of his wealth, power, and criminal influence pressing in on the conversation. That choice matters thematically, because it allows this final, crucial conversation to happen on something closer to equal footing, two people talking honestly, rather than a wealthy, powerful man and the woman whose life he's controlled within his own domain. There's also something worth noting in how vulnerable Massimo is allowed to appear in this specific sequence, a marked departure from his typical visual and performative register throughout the rest of the trilogy. The film strips away much of his usual composed, commanding presence during this confrontation, allowing him to appear genuinely uncertain, genuinely remorseful, in a way that contrasts sharply with the controlled, powerful figure we've watched across two previous films. Whether that vulnerability is sufficient to actually justify Laura giving him another chance is a question the film leaves deliberately unresolved, but the performative choice to strip away his usual armor during this specific scene does real work in making the conversation feel like a genuine reckoning rather than simply another romantic gesture in a long pattern of romantic gestures. Let's close out this deeper pass by returning, one final time, to the film's deliberately ambiguous ending, because I think it's worth sitting with exactly what that ambiguity accomplishes, and what it leaves unaddressed. By refusing to definitively resolve Laura's choice between Massimo and Nacho, the film avoids providing the kind of clean, satisfying romantic resolution that genre convention might typically demand. Some viewers found this choice frustrating, a franchise unwilling to commit to a definitive statement after 3 entire films built around exactly this central question. Others found it a more honest, more mature conclusion than a tidy pairing would have allowed, suggesting that Laura's actual journey was never really about which man wins, but about her own capacity to eventually make that choice, whenever she's ready to make it, from a place of genuine clarity rather than obligation or fear. I think there's a reasonable argument that both readings have merit simultaneously. The ambiguity is, on one hand, a genuinely interesting thematic choice, refusing to flatten Laura's journey into a simple romantic victory for either man. But it's also, on the other hand, a convenient way for the franchise to avoid having to actually defend or fully reckon with the implications of either potential ending, what it would mean for Laura to return fully to a relationship with a man whose controlling tendencies caused her demonstrated harm, or what it would mean for her to walk away entirely from a passion the franchise has spent 3 entire films insisting is genuine and irreplaceable. The film gets to gesture toward thoughtful ambiguity without ever having to fully commit to the harder work of actually resolving the tension it spent its entire runtime building. That's ultimately, I think, the most honest way to assess this film's place within its trilogy and within the broader cultural conversation it generated. It's a story that began by romanticizing genuinely troubling behavior, spent 2 films deepening that romanticization through escalating danger and passion, and then, in this final chapter, made a genuine if imperfect attempt to step back and ask harder questions about autonomy, trauma, and what its protagonist actually needs rather than simply what makes for compelling melodrama. It doesn't fully succeed at reconciling those competing impulses. But the attempt itself, however unevenly executed, represents more genuine thematic ambition than this franchise's reputation typically credits it with, even as that ambition remains permanently undercut by the troubling foundation the entire story was built on from its very first act. Let's spend just a little more time on one final thread before we wrap up entirely, because the Adriano subplot, established at the very start of this film through Massimo's graveside visit, carries quiet implications worth examining one more time. Adriano, Massimo's twin brother, functioned across the previous installment as a kind of dark mirror to Massimo himself, a man who shared his brother's bloodline and his family's violent legacy but who expressed that inheritance through outright villainy rather than the more complicated, partially sympathetic menace the franchise has always afforded Massimo. His death, and the death of Anna alongside him, represents the literal, narrative closing of the franchise's most overtly villainous thread, clearing the field, structurally, for this final film to focus more narrowly on the central romantic triangle without the distraction of an active, external antagonist actively threatening Laura's physical safety. That structural clearing matters considerably to understanding why this film feels so different in pace and tone from its predecessors. With the franchise's most dangerous external threat removed, the story has nowhere left to generate tension except through the internal, psychological conflict between Laura, Massimo, and Nacho, which is precisely the conflict this film spends its runtime trying, with mixed success, to make compelling on its own terms, without the assistance of kidnapping plots, rival families, or gunshot wounds to externalize and dramatize the stakes. There's something worth noting in how this narrows the franchise's scope in its final chapter, forcing it to actually reckon with whether its central romantic dynamic can sustain genuine dramatic interest purely through interpersonal, psychological tension, without the heightened genre machinery that propelled the earlier films. The fact that this final film struggles, at points, to maintain that interest purely through character-driven conflict suggests that the franchise's earlier reliance on external danger and violence wasn't simply lazy plotting, but was actually doing real, necessary structural work in generating forward momentum that the underlying romantic relationships, examined more closely and with fewer external distractions, don't always sustain entirely on their own. That's a meaningful, if somewhat unflattering, observation about the franchise's underlying foundations. Strip away the kidnapping, the rival mafia families, the gunshots and explosions, and what's left is a romantic triangle that, examined closely and patiently across this final film's more reflective runtime, reveals itself to be considerably thinner and less psychologically substantial than the franchise's earlier, more breathlessly paced installments allowed audiences time to notice. This final film's relative critical and commercial underperformance compared to its predecessors might say less about any particular failure of execution unique to this third installment, and more about what happens when you finally slow down long enough to look directly at a foundation that was never actually built to support that kind of sustained, patient scrutiny. And yet, even acknowledging that limitation, there remains something genuinely worth respecting in a franchise willing to attempt that scrutiny at all, rather than simply doubling down indefinitely on escalating spectacle for its own sake. Plenty of successful franchises, across film and television alike, simply continue delivering more of whatever formula initially proved successful, expanding scale and stakes without ever pausing to actually examine the underlying relationships and dynamics that formula depends on. This trilogy, whatever its considerable flaws, at least made a genuine attempt, in its final chapter, to ask its own foundational premise some hard questions, even if it didn't fully have satisfying answers ready by the time the credits rolled. That willingness to ask the question, even without fully answering it, is probably the most generous and most accurate way to remember this particular franchise's conclusion. Not a triumphant final chapter. Not a film that resolves the considerable tensions and controversies that defined this entire trilogy's cultural footprint. But a genuine, if imperfect, attempt to look back at where this story started and ask whether passion alone, however intense, however cinematically compelling, was ever actually enough to build a real, sustainable life on. The film's answer, delivered through Laura's deliberately unresolved final choice, suggests that the franchise itself isn't entirely sure, and that uncertainty, however frustrating it might be as a final note to end an entire trilogy on, feels, in its own way, more honest than a tidier, more conventionally satisfying conclusion would have been. Final rating, 4 out of 10. A film that deserves modest credit for attempting genuine thematic growth and reflection within a franchise that previously showed little interest in either, undermined considerably by thin plotting, uneven pacing, and a fundamental inability to fully reconcile its belated message about personal autonomy with the deeply troubling romantic premise the entire trilogy was originally built upon. If this breakdown gave you a clearer sense of how this trilogy actually concludes, and what it was attempting underneath all the controversy, let me know in the comments whether you think Laura made the right call. Or the right non-call. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more stories left to unpack.